appropriate course going forward. Thank you, sir.
I understand this is not a split call. Sue Moroney, 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And it is a pleasure to rise and speak to the second reading of the Child Support Amendment Bill. A bill, as many other speakers have said in this debate, has been a long time coming, because it is in fact more than 20 years since this issue was revisited. And of course, we all do recognise right across the House the need to review, particularly in situations like this where family relationships are complex matters and do move and change as society evolves and changes, and that of course is precisely what's happened in this situation, that it is 21 years since the child support legislation has been revisited. Things have changed, and we all acknowledge, certainly Labor voted for this at first reading because we wanted the opportunity to have a good close look at this in Select Committee. We recognise the need to update this legislation, but sadly in this instance we think the government has got it wrong, Mr Speaker. And actually we think the government's got it wrong at a very fundamental level, not just in some of the fine detail, but actually at a very fundamental level. Because this piece of legislation that we're visiting here, Mr Speaker, is called the Child Support Amendment Bill. It's about child support. And it's Labor's view that we would come up with a different set of conclusions in reviewing this legislation if the interests of the child were put solidly at the centre of every consideration that the government and the Select Committee made about this piece of legislation. And I do want to refer to the speech from the member who just spoke immediately before me, because I think he put it in a nutshell, actually. He said that he'd dealt with 2 cases recently where the outcomes would have been better for the parents if this piece of legislation had already been enacted. He said the outcome would be better for the parents. He had no comment to make about whether the outcome would have been better for the child or not. And that, Mr Speaker, is the basic problem that the government, the basic mistake that the government is making. Because the whole point of this legislation is to ensure that in situations where there is a family relationship breakdown, that the children are taken care of. That's what this bill is about. It is not about serving the interests of the parents. It is first and foremost about serving the interests of the children. And the National MP, who just resumed his seat, I think spelled it out loud and clear for us, that the government has got sidelined by actually getting involved in working out the whole thing about whether parents win or lose under this arrangement. And that's where they've gone so badly wrong. This is not about the argy-bargy that goes on between parents. This legislation ought to be about putting children at the heart of it. And I was alarmed, Mr Speaker, when because I'm not a permanent member of the Select Committee that heard this legislation, but I did have the opportunity to sit in on some of the deliberations and certainly some of the submissions during the course of the Select Committee deliberations on this bill. And one of the days where I was present, there was a debate about some wording changes that Labor was proposing to ensure that in the objectives of this amendment bill was a statement about the interests of the child and making that central to this piece of legislation. I was alarmed that the national members on that committee were opposed to that concept. And that was an alarm bell that went off for me, because I could not understand why setting that out as a basic premise and objective for this amendment and this review would be opposed by government members on that Select Committee. It seemed to me a very basic requirement that should be at the heart of this legislation. So not only is it that the government members have inadvertently overlooked this really fundamentally important part of this legislation, they deliberately opposed amending the objective of this piece of legislation in order to protect the interests of children first and foremost. Mr Speaker, I'm Labor spokesperson for Women's Affairs, and I, of course, am interested in what the impacts will be on women of this change in legislation. And the impacts, I'm sad to report to this House, are not good. They are not favourable generally for women. And of course, as people have said, these individual family situations can be quite different to each other. So there is by no means one silver bullet. But if you look across an average of what will happen in this legislation, and accepting, as it is still in New Zealand to this day, that most of the parents who are the main carers of children in this situation will be women, are in fact women, because that's what the statistics tell us, then we need to understand that there are gender implications for this legislation as well. The legislation does have significant implications for women because on average women earn less than men, and as I've just said, they are much more likely to be the primary caregiver. And the overall effect of this bill is to apportion even a greater share of the cost of child-rearing to women. So many women will be worse off as a result of this legislation. One of the main mechanisms for that is the reduced threshold for shared care. That reduced threshold for shared care actually puts in a financial incentive for mainly fathers who are the liable parent, not the custodial parent, in the main, not always, Mr Speaker, but in the main. It puts in a financial incentive for them to want to get involved in the care of their children, because it will cost them less. It will actually cost them less. Well, the member says that sounds good, but if the member was to put the interests of the child at the heart of that situation, would we really want fathers to actually get involved in shared care because there's enough financial incentive for them to do so? Is that really what we want? I certainly don't think that's a good outcome. It's not a good outcome, and the National MPs may think that's a good outcome, but I don't. I want shared care arrangements to be genuine. I want them to be in the best interests of children. I don't want them to be based on some accounting book exercise that a father does to work out how he can pay less in liable contributions, because that's what this piece of legislation actually invites. Now, if that was in the best interests of the child, I'd be the first to agree to it. But actually putting a financial incentive there to try and increase shared care is not necessarily in the interests of the child. But what it does do, Mr Speaker, is it does actually unfairly impact on women, because we know that parents caring for a child 2 days a week are actually unlikely to share a proportionate responsibility for providing the basics of life. So while they might share food bills proportionately because they've got the child or the children for 2 days of the week, they're really unlikely to be paying for the cost of school uniforms. They are quite unlikely to be sharing the proportionate cost of the clothing, doctor's appointments, dental costs, all of those week-to-week, day-to-day expenses in providing for children. So it is under this mechanism that we know that on average there will be a shift, there will be a further burden of cost shifted onto women who are in the main the primary caregivers by that mechanism. My contention, and what I want to put before this House, is that we cannot afford to do that. That's why my colleagues have been talking about child poverty, and it's linked to this bill, because we already know that women who are sole parents are in this poverty trap, and therefore their children, who they have the primary caregiving role for, are in that poverty trap. That is the link with child poverty, Mr Speaker. It's not acceptable for this government to be passing legislation that actually worsens child poverty when New Zealanders are calling out for them to do something about improving poverty. So, Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to say that Labor is opposing this bill because it is not necessarily in the best interests of children.
Paul Goldsmith.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to take a short call in favour